Welcome to TOCHI Stories. Please don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on post notification because it will mean the whole world to me. Now let's get right into the story. Brace yourself. The rooftop was alive with sin and laughter. Champagne flowed like river water, and laughter rose above Lagos' glittering skyline. Donatus Don Okoye leaned back in a custom leather chair, a Cuban cigar in hand and a smug smirk curving his lips. The billionaire tycoon had just closed a massive international deal, and the boys, Dare, Chief Emma, Kelvin, and Tito, had gathered to celebrate. This wasn't a group of ordinary men. They were the sharks who ran politics in private and rewrote policies behind closed glass doors. As the music mellowed into a low hum and the women momentarily retreated to the pool, Tito poured another glass and joked, "Don, you've conquered everything except marriage. Or is it because you know no woman can actually stand you?" The others erupted with laughter. Don smiled lazily, unbothered, until Dare leaned in with a gleam in his eye. "Bet you can't keep a woman for 90 days. Not a model, not an heiress, a homeless one. Raw, real, not polished, and not a word of kindness from you." The table fell silent for a moment until Don chuckled. "You underestimate my control." With a clink of glasses, the bet was sealed. What started as a tasteless dare quickly escalated into a formal challenge. If Don could legally marry a woman from the streets, keep her under his roof without giving her any makeover, luxury, or love for 90 days, he would win the final piece of land his empire needed. Land owned by Chief Emma. But if he lost, if he backed out or broke the rule, he would forfeit the biggest real estate merger of his career. Don didn't even blink. His confidence was legendary, the kind that made investors hand him billions and rivals tremble. He waved his assistant over and instructed, "Find me a woman from the gutter. One who knows nothing of comfort. One who has nothing to lose." The men laughed. To them, this was sport, another billionaire game played with real lives and real consequences. A waitress passing by hesitated, her tray trembling slightly at the cruelty she overheard. Don noticed, raised an eyebrow, but said nothing. This was just another night, another joke, another game he was sure he'd win. What none of them knew, as they clinked their glasses again under the stars, was that they had just wagered on a woman who once held dreams bigger than any of theirs. A woman who once stood before hundreds, giving speeches on justice and truth. A woman who had been hunted, broken, and cast out, not because she wasn't good enough, but because she was too good to play by corruption's rules. Somewhere beneath a tattered scarf and sunburned skin, Ioma Chukwuemeka, former law prodigy, top of her class, once beloved by professors and feared by criminals, sat huddled on cardboard by a roadside food kiosk. And the road she was about to walk would shake every brick Don Okoye thought he laid in pride. The sun had barely risen when a black Mercedes-Benz Maybach crawled into the dusty junction near Ajagano. The driver, a middle-aged man in crisp white native wear, looked visibly uncomfortable as he stepped out, the scent of diesel and damp clothes immediately hitting his nose. He looked around, unsure, until his eyes landed on a thin woman sitting alone near a burnt-out kiosk. Her head was bent, her face half covered by a faded scarf. Her gown had long since lost its color, her slippers were mismatched, and she held an empty stainless plate like a memory of food. He cleared his throat and approached cautiously. "You, madam. My Oga wants to see you," he said gruffly. The woman didn't look up. "I'm not a prostitute," she replied, her voice low but firm. The driver hesitated, then added, "He wants to marry you." That made her glance up, eyes dull with disbelief. "Excuse me," she said, stunned. "Legally." "Today," the man said, "he will pay for your food, your shelter, for 90 days. You know, go suffer." There was no smile in his voice. Only business. Only urgency. Still in shock, Ioma followed him silently, her stomach twisted in confusion. Marriage? To a stranger? What did he want from her? She had survived attempted rape, mob violence, and humiliation. She had eaten from trash cans and watched dogs sleep in better shade. What more could the world possibly strip from her? But something in her heart whispered, "Go." And so she went. The car's chilled air, was the first cool breeze she had felt in months. Her skin goosebumped. The mansion that greeted her was a fortress. Tall white pillars, manicured lawns, guard dogs. She was ushered inside without eye contact. A registrar sat in the living room, already stamping papers. Don appeared from the balcony, shirtless, holding a flute of mimosa. "You'll sleep in the staff quarters. Don't enter my office. Don't speak unless spoken to. And don't imagine for a second that you matter." Then, with one lazy stroke, he signed the marriage certificate. "Smile," he said, handing her a pen. She didn't. She signed. No guests. No cake. No name change. Just cold marble floors, hostile stares, and a man who saw her as a bet. Ioma stood awkwardly by the doorway until a guard pointed to the servant quarters. The room had no fan, no mattress, only a thin mat and one threadbare pillow. She sat down and stared at her hands. Once they held law books. Once they wrote court appeals and love letters. Now they trembled from starvation. "You married a devil," she whispered to herself. But she didn't cry. She hadn't cried in years. Somewhere deep within her, the flame hadn't died, only dimmed. And in that silent, suffocating mansion, surrounded by men who laughed at her like a joke, that flame began to stir. From the moment she entered the compound, the mockery began like a symphony rehearsed. The house staff had been warned. She wasn't to be treated as madam. She wasn't to be acknowledged unless in emergencies. Her food was delivered on a metal tray and left by the staff room door, always cold, always late. The maids whispered behind her back. One of the guards nicknamed her Madam Carton because of the flattened cardboard she slept on. The driver refused to greet her. Everyone took their cue from Don. And Don? He ignored her completely, as though she were an ugly statue someone left behind in a museum. She would walk into the kitchen and conversations would abruptly stop. She would greet the cook and get a cold side eye. Her presence made everyone uncomfortable, not because she was rude, but because she reflected everything they had been taught to fear and laugh at: poverty, disgrace, survival. But Ioma didn't scream. She didn't fight. Instead, she began cleaning. At first, it was out of boredom, then necessity. She swept the corridor leading to her quarters. She folded her own wrapper neatly every morning. She washed her plate, even though it was never clean when delivered. On the third day, she picked up the mop when she saw the maid struggling with a heavy bucket. The girl hissed and walked away, but Ioma kept mopping anyway. Mama Ioma, Don's oldest staff, the housemaid who had raised him since he was a boy, noticed quietly from the stairwell. That evening, she slipped a small bar of soap by Ioma's door with a note: "You're not a beggar. Wash the world off." Ioma smiled for the first time in years. Meanwhile, Don received daily updates from his friends. They sent mocking videos. Project Beggar. Day 4. "She still breathing?" Dare asked during a call. "I'd have packed her off by now." Don laughed on cue, pretending to be unaffected. But something about her silence irritated him. He wanted her to break, to scream, to fight for relevance. But she didn't. And that quiet resistance, that unspoken dignity, began to haunt him. Not as guilt, not yet, but as something familiar. And somewhere deep in his untouched soul, the game had already begun to lose its flavor. In the stillness of early morning, before the clatter of pots and the gossip of maids filled the air, Ioma rose from her mat with aching limbs and quietly began sweeping the hallway outside her quarters. It wasn't her duty. No one asked her to. But the floor was covered with red dust from the garden paths, and she couldn't stand living in filth. She tied her scarf tightly around her head, wiped the sweat from her brow, and continued. The guard sitting nearby smirked. "Madam Beggar now wants to become housekeeper," he muttered, sipping his tea. Ioma said nothing. She bent lower, dragging the broom against the stubborn edges of the tiles, her fingers raw, her spine throbbing. She had cleaned many places since falling: restaurant bathrooms, roadside gutters, and even the feet of men who spat on her. This wasn't shame. This was survival. And survival, to her, was sacred. Later that afternoon, she walked into the kitchen to return her dirty plate. The cook, a heavy-set woman named Ezen, scowled. Next time leave it outside. We don't need flies in here. Ioma nodded and turned to leave. But just before stepping out, she noticed the cook's young son trying to do his homework in a corner, struggling with English comprehension. Gently, she squatted beside him and asked, "May I?" The boy looked unsure, but nodded. In a calm, almost maternal voice, she helped him understand the passage, breaking it down into bite-sized meaning. The boy's face lit up in understanding. Ezen watched, arms folded, trying not to show the gratitude softening her glare. That night, Mama Ioma came into Ioma's room with a bucket of clean water and a pack of soap. "I know a woman of value when I see one," she whispered. "Don may not know yet, but I do." Don, meanwhile, scrolled through his phone lazily in the study, sipping aged whiskey and ignoring the buzzing of his conscience. His friends had just sent him a new meme of Ioma sweeping, her face edited onto a broomstick with the caption, "CEO of Dust Corp Limited." He chuckled on reflex, but quickly grew bored. He had expected her to cry, to run, to plead. But every report he got said the same thing. She kept to herself, she worked, she smiled faintly at children. "Why is she not breaking?" he muttered. Part of him wanted her to explode, to yell at the injustice. Instead, she was haunting him with her restraint. Like a storm he didn't see coming, her silence rattled his walls more than screams ever could. The first real conversation between Don and Ioma didn't come with fanfare or drama. It came quietly, unexpectedly, like most truths do. He found her in the upstairs library, barefoot, reading an old business newspaper from the year before. He had come in to retrieve a file, but the sight of her calmly flipping through the pages stopped him. "Trying to learn how rich people think," he mocked from the doorway, his voice laced with condescension. She didn't look up. She simply continued reading, her finger trailing the edge of a headline about stock fraud. Irritated by her lack of reaction, he stepped closer. "You know those stories are for people who actually matter, right?" he said. Still no reaction. Finally, she looked up, not with anger, but with a gaze so steady it unnerved him. "Even silence knows when words are useless," she said softly, then turned the page. Don was dumbstruck. Her voice wasn't desperate. It wasn't defiant. It was whole, measured. It carried the calm of someone who had survived worse storms than him. He stood there longer than necessary, the sarcastic comeback stuck in his throat. Who is this woman, he thought. She wasn't trembling like the others had. Most of the models, heiresses, and gold diggers he had toyed with over the years had either begged for favor or raged when ignored. But Ioma did neither. Her composure stung his pride. He left without another word. But that night, as he lay in bed watching city lights flicker outside his window, he kept hearing her voice. Even silence knows when words are useless. It echoed in his chest louder than her footsteps ever had. He turned restlessly under his silk sheets, suddenly aware of how heavy his wealth felt. Elsewhere, Ioma closed the newspaper, walked back to her room, and sat in the dim glow of a lantern. She didn't smile. She didn't celebrate. But inside her, something shifted. She had spoken, not to survive, but to be heard. She had reminded herself that her voice still existed. Her silence had been armor for years, forged by rejection, betrayal, and loss. But that moment of speech, it tasted like breath. She knew he would never forget what she said. And that was enough. That night, she washed her feet, changed into the only clean wrapper she had, and prayed. Not for rescue, not for love, but for clarity, because she could sense that something dangerous was awakening in Don Okoye. And if she wasn't careful, she would become the very thing she fought to heal from. 3 days later, the mansion was abuzz with tension. Don was in meetings all morning, barely speaking to the staff, his jaw locked tight, and his eyes sharp with calculation. A deal was on the table, a massive contract that would tie his company to a foreign tech conglomerate. His lawyers were pushing him to sign. The proposal looked flawless on paper, but something about it felt slippery. "If we don't close this today, we'll lose the stake to Utachukwu Holdings," one of his consultants warned. Don leaned back, tapping the edge of the file with a frown. He needed this acquisition. His reputation as Nigeria's most fearless investor was on the line. But his gut whispered caution. And for the first time in years, he didn't trust his usual instincts. That evening, he walked into his private study to think alone. The file was on the desk. The air was heavy with the smell of ink, paper, and expensive cologne. Ioma, having just mopped the corridor outside, passed by with her bucket. She paused for a moment, seeing the tension on his face through the open door. "You're not allowed in here," he muttered without looking up. "I know," she replied. "But sometimes fast profits are just slow poison in disguise." He looked up sharply. "What did you just say?" She stood still, gripping her mop, her eyes unwavering. "That contract. It's too neat. If something looks too perfect, someone's hiding the dirt underneath." She didn't say another word. She turned and walked away, leaving muddy footprints behind, the only trace of her presence. Don sat there for almost an hour after she left, replaying her words. He pulled the file closer, scanned it again, and began to see the red flags he had missed. A hidden clause about asset conversion. A vague liability note buried on page 11. His pulse quickened. If he had signed, it could have legally compromised his Nigerian holdings. He picked up the phone, called his legal team, and barked, "Delay the contract." Indefinitely. Silence followed on the other end, then murmured confusion. But he didn't care. Her words had changed his direction, and possibly saved his empire. For the first time since the bet began, Don felt something unfamiliar. Discomfort and gratitude. Not that he'd say it out loud. Not yet. But a seed had been planted, and it was growing through the concrete of his pride. Don sat behind his massive mahogany desk with one leg crossed over the other, swirling a glass of cognac he hadn't even tasted. The room was quiet except for the hum of his air conditioner, but his mind was in chaos. The deal Ioma warned him about had collapsed, and not just collapsed, it had burned. That same foreign company had been exposed in a money laundering scandal, dragging down two of his rivals with them. Chief Udachukwu, the same man who had mocked Don on the pages of Forbes Africa, was now facing legal scrutiny. If Don had signed, his name would be in the middle of that fire. The realization made him cold inside. And the worst part? The person who had saved him wasn't his lawyers, his team of experts, or any of his overpriced consultants. It was the girl they all called Project Beggar. A girl he hadn't even allowed to eat at his table. But gratitude didn't come easily to a man like Don. Instead of approaching Ioma, he sank deeper into avoidance. He canceled their daily meals entirely, pretending it was due to renovations. He avoided eye contact in the hallway and locked his study door from the inside. His friends began to notice the shift. During a weekend poker game, Dare, now irritated, confronted him. "You're treating this bet like a marriage, bro. That girl's messing with your head," he said, tossing his cards on the table. "You're supposed to break her, not bend with her." The other men laughed and added their usual mockery, calling Ioma a witch and wrapper, the unbreakable beggar, and Don's charity case. Don forced a chuckle, but it tasted like bile. He felt exposed, not because of their jokes, but because of how right they might be. Something in him had begun to shift, and he didn't know if it was fear, guilt, or something worse. Admiration. Back at the mansion, Ioma remained unchanged, outwardly at least. She still swept the compound in the mornings, still read newspapers left behind by staff, still cooked for herself. But something in her eyes had grown distant. She had noticed his silence. She knew the power of her words, not because she boasted in them, but because she had once been trained to advise kings and ministers. What unsettled her wasn't his avoidance. It was that she felt him watching. She could feel his gaze on her back when she bent to clean the staircase. She caught the flutter in his eyes when she explained a news article to the gardener's son. But no words came. No thank you. No apology. Just silence. And in that silence, the weight of the bet, its cruelty, its absurdity, began to weigh heavier than it had at the start. The game was turning sour, and they both felt it. Don couldn't sleep. He tossed between his silk sheets like a restless child, haunted not by nightmares, but by memory. memories he never invited. His mind replayed the way Ioma had stood in that study, mop in hand, and dismantled his million-dollar strategy with a single line. He thought about how she carried herself, how she never begged, never demanded a thing. His entire life, Don had known two types of women, those who wanted his power and those who wanted his name. Ioma wanted neither, and that frightened him more than anything. He didn't understand her, and Don hated what he couldn't understand. His ego told him she was manipulating him. His pride whispered she was dangerous. But somewhere beneath all that, in the deeper, quieter places of his being, something else murmured, "She's just different." The next morning, Don sat quietly in the security room, watching the surveillance footage from the previous night. He wasn't sure what he was looking for, maybe some sign of deception. But instead, he watched Ioma sit on the compound's bench, alone, humming an old Igbo hymn under her breath. Then, to his surprise, she pulled out a piece of paper from her wrapper and began helping the gardener's teenage daughter fill out a WEC form. "Your father's name should be written in all caps," she said gently. "And don't forget the second page." Her instructions were clear, precise, even legalistic. It was like watching a ghost step out of rags and speak fluent brilliance. Don froze the footage and leaned back in his chair. This woman wasn't random. She was hiding something, not something dark, but something luminous she had been forced to bury. And that made her even more dangerous to his bet. Later that day, curiosity drove Don to ask Mama Ioma what she knew about Ioma. The elderly maid hesitated. "That girl is not who you think she is," she said cautiously. "She's more learned than any of the lawyers you pay. I've seen the way she corrects grammar on food labels and gives legal advice to staff in whispers. She's not broken, just hiding." Don didn't respond. He just walked away. But inside, a war had begun. He started noticing things he'd ignored before, the deliberate way she avoided eye contact, the firmness in her posture when cleaning, the way children naturally gravitated toward her. These weren't traits of someone broken. These were traits of someone rebuilding themselves, brick by invisible brick. For the first time, Don wasn't looking at a bet. He was looking at a mirror, and it terrified him. The annual Hope for Lagos Charity Gala was one of the city's most exclusive events, a playground for the elite to show off their fake compassion, network over caviar, and clap for causes they didn't care about. Don arrived in a custom-made tuxedo, accompanied by two supermodels who clung to his arms like trophies. As photographers clicked and the press fawned, his eyes searched the crowd. Not for power, not for allies, but for the one woman who wasn't there. Ioma. He had deliberately banned her from attending. "You'll embarrass me," he had said 2 days earlier when she casually asked what the gala was about. She hadn't flinched, hadn't argued. She simply nodded and returned to cleaning the wine cabinet. But her absence now felt louder than any presence. The models laughed at his jokes, but he barely heard them. Even the wine tasted stale. Nothing was right. Midway through the gala, as the auction for underprivileged schoolchildren began, one of the models leaned in and whispered, "Kiss me on the cheek. Let them get a good photo." Don turned to her, his expression suddenly blank. For a moment, he considered it. It would be easy, expected. But as he leaned in, he froze. Her perfume reminded him of something. No, someone. Ioma's room, when she had washed with that cheap soap from Mama Ioma. The scent of rawness, of dignity, of quiet survival. He pulled away abruptly. "Not now," he muttered. The model blinked, confused and slightly insulted. But Don had already stood up and begun walking away from the table. Cameras followed him, but he didn't care. His friends noticed, too. Dare, sipping wine across the room, chuckled. "The beggar's warming his cold heart," he whispered to Chief Emma. "She's not even here, and he's already soft." Back at the mansion that night, Don returned to silence. He found Ioma asleep in her room, curled up on her mat, the same scarf tied around her head. For a long moment, he stood at the door, watching her breathe. She looked peaceful, like someone who had fought monsters and made peace with the scars. He thought about how easily he could have crushed her spirit, how completely he had underestimated her. And yet, here she was, still whole, still her. He wanted to speak, to say something, but he didn't. He just turned and walked away, swallowed by the darkness of the corridor, as the bet that once amused him slowly turned into the shame he could no longer ignore. Don hadn't spoken a word to wife Ioma in days, but her presence lingered in every corner of his mansion like a ghost he couldn't exorcise. The scent of the soap she used, the silent way she arranged her slippers, the disciplined order of the broom she leaned against the corridor wall, everything about her unsettled him. She wasn't playing the role he expected. She hadn't begged, screamed, or crumbled under pressure. Instead, she existed with dignity. It annoyed him, threatened him, and yet, deep down, intrigued him. On the night the board announced that his flagship mall was underperforming, he snapped. It was late. He'd had too much to drink, and the pressure of his failing bet and business losses collided in his chest like fire. He slammed his glass against the marble floor and stormed toward her quarters, his ego desperate for someone to blame. And she was the easiest target. When Don flung her door open, Ioma was kneeling by a broken lantern, reading a wrinkled piece of newspaper. Her body jolted slightly at his sudden presence, but she didn't rise. "What are you doing?" he barked. "Planning how to curse me next? Writing spells? Reading how to be more of a disappointment?" She didn't answer. Her eyes simply drifted back to the article. That infuriated him even more. "You think I don't see through your games? You walk around this house like you're some silent queen. Let me remind you, you are nothing. Nothing." Still, she didn't speak. That silence, that unshakable restraint, was the final straw. Don raised his hand, trembling with alcohol and rage. His palm hovered inches from her cheek. For a second, even he didn't know what he would do. But she looked up at him, her eyes calm, tearless, and whispered, "Then set me free." Those words pierced him, like a sword driven through pride. Set me free. As if she had never belonged here, never needed his mansion, his food, or his name. He saw then that she wasn't caged. He was. She rose slowly, her back straight, her voice level. "You have all this, and yet you're empty. You bark at silence because it reflects your loneliness." Then she walked past him, just like that. No tears, no begging, just quiet grace. Don stood there, arms still frozen midair, as shame slithered down his spine like cold oil. He had become everything he once swore he'd never be. A man who used his power to break others because he was too cowardly to face his own emptiness. That night he didn't sleep, not even for a minute. And for the first time since the bet began, he realized this wasn't a game anymore. He had crossed a line he might never be able to return from. The next morning, Don avoided everyone, including himself. He sat in his car for nearly an hour, engine running, staring at his reflection in the tinted window. The image that stared back wasn't the billionaire titan he curated on magazine covers. It was a broken boy in an expensive shell, someone who hurt a woman who had never lifted a finger against him. He hated the way he had raised his hand at her, the way her words echoed back into his hollow chest. Set me free. She was right. His life, built on conquest, dominance, and validation from friends who knew nothing of love, had become a gilded prison. He didn't go to the office that day. Instead, he wandered the mansion like a ghost. No one dared to speak to him. Even Mama Ioma, usually brave enough to confront him when necessary, kept her distance until dusk fell. She found him sitting in the garden, hands trembling slightly, his shirt halfway unbuttoned. Mama Ioma sat beside him without a word. After a long pause, she said, "You remind me of your father." Don blinked. "He was cruel?" he asked. She shook her head. "No, he was afraid. Afraid of love. Afraid that it made him weak. He lost your mother because of it." Don didn't reply. She placed a small folded piece of paper in his hand. "You want to know who that girl really is? Read this." Then she rose and walked away. Don opened the paper and began to read. Ioma Chukwemeka, University of Ibadan, best graduating law student. Legal intern at Adekunle and Company. Accused of fraud in 2017. Case dismissed. Career destroyed. Father died shortly after. Mother missing. He read it twice, then 3 more times, heart thudding. His hands shook. His breath caught in his throat. He suddenly remembered the day he'd seen her reading a court judgment in the kitchen, explaining legal terms to the gardener's daughter. The way she spoke, the calm clarity of her analysis, it all made sense now. She wasn't a homeless woman by destiny. She was a fallen star. A woman pushed into the mud not because she failed, but because she stood for something bigger than the men who tried to control her. And he Donatus Okoye had mocked her, married her as a joke, nearly slapped her for existing. The shame was suffocating. She wasn't just a victim. She was a survivor of the same system he once bribed and manipulated to get ahead. And the truth was now unbearable. Ioma was more of a person than he had ever been. The real question now wasn't whether she'd forgive him, it was whether he deserved to ask. Don woke up the next morning with a strange feeling in his chest, a mix of panic and anticipation. He rose quickly and walked to the guest quarters. But as he approached the hallway, something felt off. The corridor was too quiet. The faint scent of her morning soap was missing from the air. And when he opened the door to her room, his heart dropped. The mat was neatly folded in the corner. Her scarf was gone. The tiny lantern was cold. The soap Mama Ioma had gifted her had been left on the floor beside the door. She was gone. Don stood there, frozen, trying to process the emptiness. His first instinct was to call security, to alert the gate. But something stopped him. He knew she hadn't run away. She had left. On her own terms. The same way she had walked past him that night, with her head held high. He walked to the living room and sat in silence. His phone buzzed. It was a message from Dare. So, the beggar finally ran back to the gutter. Told you it wouldn't last. Just admit you lost and collect your punishment like a man. Don stared at the screen. Normally, he would have laughed, maybe even joined in the banter. But not today. For the first time, his friends' voices sounded like poison. The mockery, the arrogance, the heartlessness. He saw it now for what it was. A defense mechanism. A distraction from the emptiness they all felt but refused to name. Don replied with a single message. You've already lost. You just don't know it yet. Then he threw the phone aside. He walked back to the room she once occupied, sat on the floor, and whispered, You were never a bet. You were the best thing I never saw coming. Meanwhile, Ioma stood at the edge of the bridge where she once begged. It was where Don's driver had picked her up weeks ago, but this time, she wasn't seated. She wasn't barefoot. She wore a simple wrapper, carried a small bag, and stood tall. Her heart was heavy, but not broken. She had survived humiliation, silence, and a mockery so cruel it could have crushed others. Yet she stood. The sky above her was gray, but she felt no fear. A young girl nearby was being harassed by a roadside shop owner. Ioma stepped in, her voice firm, quoting the girl's legal rights without hesitation. The man backed off, mumbling. The girl looked at her like a miracle. Ioma simply smiled. She hadn't reclaimed her name yet, but she had reclaimed her voice. And far away, in a mansion that once laughed at her, a powerful man sat alone, finally realizing that the woman he threw away had become his greatest loss. Don sat in his study, surrounded by the wealth he once worshipped. Antique decor, gold-rimmed frames, glass shelves holding awards, and files from million-dollar projects. But none of it comforted him now. In the silence of the room, the only sound was the soft tick of the grandfather clock and the slow drip of a leaking faucet somewhere nearby, a haunting, rhythmic reminder of time and mistakes. On his desk lay the contract Ioma had warned him about, the one he almost signed. He picked it up, scanned the margins she'd once spoken about, and imagined the ruin he would have fallen into had she not said those words. It wasn't just the contract, it was everything. The advice, the quiet strength, her silence that wasn't weakness. He didn't deserve any of it. Don, the great Donatus Okoye, had been saved by the very woman he married as a joke. And now she was gone, truly gone. He sank into his chair, the leather groaning under his weight, and for the first time in years, he cried. Not the tearless rage of a wounded ego, not the shallow grief of business loss, but real, soul-deep sobs. the kind of weeping that comes when your spirit is finally honest. He wept for the man he had become. He wept for the damage he had done. And most of all, he wept for the love he never knew he needed until it was too late. All the nights he mocked her in silence, the times he paraded other women in front of her, the moments he belittled her intelligence just to protect his own insecurity. They came rushing back like waves crashing on a shore. He remembered how she cleaned without being told, how she helped the gardener's son without needing thanks, how she walked with quiet pride through every insult. And now, all he had left of her was a memory and a folded mat. He walked to the room she had once stayed in, sat on the cold tiled floor, and stared at the bare space she left behind. The air was different here, still, soft, scented with the lingering ghost of her presence. He noticed the soap she had once used still resting by the wall, untouched since she left. He picked it up, held it in his hand like it was sacred, and whispered her name, Ioma. The name that once meant nothing to him now carried the weight of everything he'd lost. For hours he remained there, his mind spiraling through memory and regret. And in that silence, the powerful, ruthless billionaire who had once bet on a woman's dignity realized the cost of his arrogance. Not in dollars, not in headlines, but in heart. And no amount of wealth could buy back what had been broken. Don's redemption didn't begin with a grand gesture. It started with an investigation. Not because he wanted to hurt Ioma, but because he needed to understand her pain, her silence, and her story. He hired one of the most discreet private investigators in Lagos and gave only one instruction: find everything about her, but be respectful. She deserves that much. Days passed. Every night, Don sat in silence, waiting for updates. He didn't party. He didn't attend meetings. The business world began to wonder if something was wrong. But Don didn't care. For once, numbers didn't matter. He wanted truth. And when the truth finally came, it hit harder than any scandal he'd ever faced. The investigator delivered a thick folder. Inside were university transcripts, glowing recommendation letters, newspaper clippings of her being awarded by the Ministry of Youth and Education. And then, the scandal. It wasn't a real crime. It was vengeance. Ioma had been interning at a prestigious law firm, and her supervisor, a senior partner, had tried to force himself on her after hours. She fought back and reported it. But instead of being protected, she was accused of stealing client files. The firm spun the story fast. Her scholarship was withdrawn, her name sent to legal chambers' blacklists, and within weeks, everything she had built crumbled. Don turned to a grainy screenshot of the man, Mr. Ajayi, yelling at a bartender in a clip dug up from a private birthday party. In it, he laughed drunkenly and said, "I told her no one would believe a poor girl over a man like me." And they didn't. That one sentence shattered Don all over again. He stared at the images, the transcripts, and the timeline of her destruction. He saw the obituary of her father, who died of heart failure weeks after the scandal broke. He read through a note allegedly written by Ioma's mother, missing since that year, describing how her daughter had once tutored orphan children for free. Every piece of her past was a testament to the kind of woman he had failed to see. It wasn't just that she had been brilliant, she had been brave. She had tried to fight a corrupt system and paid the price. Don sat with a folder in his lap, unable to breathe properly. All this time, she had walked through his house carrying 1,000 wounds and never once made him feel guilty. She had never begged for pity. She just existed with dignity. And now that he knew her story, the only thing he wanted was to find her, not to save her, but to say, "I see you now." Don stood quietly under the rusted pedestrian bridge in Ojuelegba, dressed in plain clothes for the first time in years. No security, no fanfare, just a man stripped bare of pride, searching for a woman whose soul had taught him how to see again. He walked slowly, asking questions to street vendors, scanning the faces of people sleeping in corners, crouched by fire barrels or curled beneath torn blankets. And then he saw her. She sat near a cracked concrete column, speaking gently to two young women. One was pregnant. The other had a bruised eye. Ioma's voice was soft but firm. "No matter what he did, it's not your fault. You can get help. and you have legal rights. Don's breath caught. She hadn't vanished, she had bloomed. Even in brokenness, she had become a lighthouse for others lost at sea. He approached her slowly, heart pounding like a boy seeing his first crush. When she looked up, their eyes met, and in that moment, the world stood still. She didn't flinch, didn't blink. Her gaze was steady, unreadable. He lowered himself to her level, knees on the dusty ground, and said only 4 words, "I came to listen." Ioma didn't respond immediately. She glanced at the girls beside her, excused herself gently, and rose to her feet. "What do you want, Don?" she asked. Her tone wasn't angry. It was tired, heavy, not from weakness, but from surviving too much. Don swallowed hard. "I didn't come to defend myself. I didn't come to justify what I did. I came because I finally see the woman I wronged, and I will carry that shame forever." She stared at him, arms folded, face unreadable. After a long silence, she said, "You don't need my forgiveness. What you need is to forgive yourself, because only then will you stop repeating what broke you." Then she turned and walked away, not in bitterness, but in peace. Don didn't follow her. He stood there in the dust, watching the woman he once mocked walk toward the sunset, her back straight, her spirit intact. She had saved his business, changed his life, and reminded him of who he once was, all without asking for a thing. He knew then that some love stories aren't built on romance or kisses. Some are built on truth, humility, and the courage to finally kneel before what you once trampled. And as she disappeared into the distance, Don whispered to himself, "I lost the bet, but I may have just found myself." The sun beat down on the massive oak doors of the Okoye Global Tower as reporters, cameras, and bloggers filled the conference hall to capacity. The press release had been vague. Major announcement from Donatus Okoye. The business world expected a merger, a new project, perhaps even a political move. But inside, Don stood silently behind the podium in a plain black suit, no designer lapel pin, no branded backdrop behind him. Just a microphone, a glass of water, and the weight of a nation watching. He looked tired, not physically, but emotionally, spiritually. For a man whose empire was built on ego, this was the moment his kingdom cracked open. His media manager leaned over and whispered, "You sure about this?" Don nodded. "Let the world hear it from me. For once, the truth." He cleared his throat as the murmurs died down. "Good morning. My name is Donatus Okoye. For years, many of you have known me as a business mogul, a billionaire, a strategist. But today I stand before you as a man, a deeply flawed one." He paused. "Several months ago, I accepted a cruel bet. I married a woman from the streets, not for love, not even for companionship, but to prove a point to men whose approval I no longer respect. I thought I could control her, mold her, break her. I thought poverty meant weakness, and silence meant submission." Gasps rippled through the hall. Phones shook. Journalists leaned forward. But she wasn't weak. She was wiser than any of us. She warned me about a deal that would have destroyed my company. She taught me integrity without speaking much. And I, blinded by pride, ignored, mocked, and humiliated her. The words hung heavy in the air. Don reached into his coat and pulled out the folded contract, the one Ioma saved him from, and held it up. "This document represents everything I could have lost, if not for her wisdom. And yet, I couldn't even say thank you. I raised my hand at her. I allowed her to be mocked by my friends and staff. I called her nothing, when she was everything I wasn't." His voice cracked. "Her name is Ioma Chukwuemeka, once Nigeria's brightest law student, silenced by a corrupt system. She didn't need me to redeem her, but I needed her to remember who I was before greed owned me." The room was dead silent. Not a single flashbulb popped. Everyone watched a titan unravel before them and become human. "This isn't an apology to win her back," Don said softly. "This is a public confession. Because power without accountability is cowardice. And I've been a coward long enough." Then he stepped down, left the room, and walked into a future that would be nothing like the past he built on arrogance. The footage of the press conference went viral within hours. Hashtags flooded every platform. Hashtag Ioma the Brave. Hashtag Don Confesses. Hashtag Street Bride No More. Across Nigeria, something deeper than gossip stirred. Women in law groups reposted her name with reverence. University alumni dug up old photos of her giving campus speeches, standing before auditoriums with fire in her eyes and brilliance in her voice. A movement began not just to defend Ioma, but to interrogate a system that had chewed her up and spat her out. News channels revisited her case. Legal experts reanalyzed the firm that destroyed her reputation. And then the evidence came. Video footage leaked by a whistleblower inside the firm. In the grainy clip, her former boss laughed at a dinner party, openly admitting, "She rejected me. So I had to teach her a lesson. Women with brains are always the hardest to control." That video exploded like a firebomb. Within a day, the legal firm was under federal investigation. The Nigerian Bar Association suspended key members. The university issued a public apology for its silence during the scandal years ago. But what truly moved the nation wasn't just justice. It was Ifeoma's quiet response. She released a short statement through a community shelter where she now volunteered. "I'm not the only woman this has happened to. I'm just one of many who refuse to stay buried." The statement ended with a call to action, not for revenge, but for reform. Soon, law students across the country formed advocacy clubs in her name. A women's foundation offered to fund her continued legal training. And most significantly, the Lagos state government announced a new scholarship program, the Ioma Justice Fund, aimed at helping survivors of false accusations and abuse reclaim their careers. Don watched all of this from the sidelines, not seeking credit, but feeling deeply humbled. He declined interview offers and profile pieces. He wasn't the story. She was. And she was rising higher than any of them could have imagined. Mama Ioma smiled one evening and said, "She's doing what you never could with all your money. She's changing lives without lifting her voice." Don nodded, a bittersweet pride blooming in his chest. He knew he might never be her husband again. But witnessing her soar? That was a blessing he didn't deserve but was grateful to witness. For once, he was content to watch from the shadows, as the world embraced the woman he had once overlooked. Weeks passed. Ioma remained elusive to the public, politely declining speaking engagements and interviews. She focused on her work with displaced women and quietly began the process of reclaiming her legal identity. But one rainy afternoon, a sleek black car pulled up outside the shelter where she worked. It wasn't flashy, but familiar. Don stepped out holding a small box, not with cameras behind him, not with a speech rehearsed. He simply waited. When she saw him, she didn't smile. She didn't frown either. She walked to him, her scarf tucked neatly under her chin, her arms folded. "Why are you here?" she asked. "Because I'm ready to return what I stole," he replied. Then he opened the box. Inside was the deed to his mansion, fully signed over in her name. "It's yours, whether or not you ever walk through its doors again." Ioma stared at the document, eyes scanning the legalities she once lived and breathed. "Why?" she asked quietly. Don took a breath. "Because that house was built on cruelty, and only you ever gave it meaning." She didn't take the box immediately. She looked at him, trying to find deception, manipulation, but there was none. Just sincerity, aged by humility. Finally, she said, "I won't take it unless the staff are allowed to return. The cook, the gardener, the ones who treated me kindly." Don smiled gently. "They never left. They begged to stay, hoping you would come back one day." Her eyes softened just slightly. "Then let's go home," she said, not because the mansion meant comfort, but because she was now entering it on her terms. When she arrived at the house later that evening, it was different. The guards greeted her with respect. Mama Ioma wept silently as she opened the gate. The staff clapped in quiet celebration. Flowers lined the hallway. The guest room she had once been confined to was now the largest suite in the house. Her books were back. Her clothes, washed, folded, expanded. In the corner sat a framed quote, "Then set me free." Don didn't join her that night. He stayed in the guest wing, knowing she needed space. But before they parted, she looked at him and said, "This house is no longer a prison. It's a story of what happens when power kneels to grace." And with that, Ioma re-entered the mansion not as a pawn, not as a pity project, not even as a wife, but as a woman who had walked through fire and turned every scar into light. The following days inside the mansion were quiet, not in discomfort, but in mutual understanding. Ioma moved with calm authority. She reinstated the gardener's son's tutoring, organized reading sessions for the staff's children, and set up a small community outreach unit in one of the spare lounges. She brought life into a house that had once felt like a throne built on emptiness. Don watched all this from afar, never imposing, never assuming. He didn't act entitled to her time or affection. In his silence, he offered the one thing he'd never offered anyone before: patience. He was changing, but he no longer changed for approval. He changed because the mirror she had held up to him had shown him the truth. And the truth was, he had been a powerful man with a rotting soul. Ioma's light didn't just expose his darkness, it taught him how to heal it. One evening, Don requested a conversation. No staff, no distractions, just them. They sat beneath the tree at the edge of the compound, the one where she had once cried after being insulted by his friends. Now the same tree stood witness to something else entirely. "Ioma," he began, voice low, "I know I don't deserve another chance. I ruined something sacred. But if I could turn back time, I wouldn't erase the bet. I'd erase the man who thought it was a game." She listened without interrupting. He pulled a small velvet box from his pocket, not with confidence, but trembling hope. This time no cameras, no conditions, just me, kneeling before the woman who saved me from myself. He opened it, a simple silver ring with her name engraved inside. "If you say no, I'll understand. I'll still spend my life honoring you, even from a distance." She didn't take the box. Instead, she reached out and closed it gently with her fingers. "Don, I don't want you kneeling anymore. I want you walking beside me, not ahead of me, not behind me. And not because of guilt, but because you finally understand love has nothing to do with control." He exhaled, his heart pounding not in fear, but in awe. "So is that a yes?" he asked softly. She smiled, a real one, the first he had seen since the bet began. "It's a maybe built on trust. Earn it." For Don, that maybe was more precious than any yes he had ever received in boardrooms, contracts, or applause. Because this one wasn't bought. It was offered as a seed of something real. Weeks later, under the shade of that same tree where their story had both fractured and begun, a small, quiet vow renewal took place. No press, no luxury, no guests in diamonds. Just Mama Ioma, the staff who had become family, the gardener's son holding a Bible, and two people who had shed their masks completely. Don wore a plain white native attire, no chains, no flair. Ioma wore a soft peach gown that flowed like water, her hair in a simple twist, no makeup except the soft gloss on her lips. She walked toward him barefoot by choice, to remind herself of where she had come from, and how far she had walked to reclaim her name. As she stood before him, she didn't look like a victim. She looked like grace personified, dignity in motion. Don took her hands gently. "The first time I stood before you, I was blind, arrogant, cruel. I called you nothing. I mocked your pain. I weaponized your silence. But now, I know. You are everything I didn't know I needed. Your strength, your wisdom, your peace, they saved me. I chased you away the night I should have knelt. And I will regret it every day with love." Ioma squeezed his hands, tears brimming in her eyes, but not falling. "And the first time I stood before you, I was invisible. You saw rags, not scars. You saw silence, not stories. But I never needed you to save me. I needed you to see me. And now that you do, let this not be the start of a marriage, but the continuation of truth." Their vows weren't poetic. They were real, and that made them holy. As they exchanged rings, not gold, but carved wooden bands crafted by local artisans she had supported, the gardener's son, now smiling proudly in his school uniform, said the final words. I now pronounce you partners in love, in truth, and in light." The small gathering clapped. Mama Ioma wiped her eyes. And as the breeze rustled the leaves above, it was as if the mansion itself sighed in relief. The curse was broken. The bet had died. And in its place bloomed something none of them could have predicted. A love not rooted in grand gestures, but in small redemptions. A love that had walked barefoot through hell, and still found home. And as Ioma and Don stood hand in hand beneath the tree that had witnessed both cruelty and transformation, she leaned in and whispered, "This time we begin again. Not as broken people, but as better ones." Thank you for watching this video. What did you learn from this story? Drop it in the comments. Please make sure you like, comment, and subscribe to my YouTube channel TOCHI Stories for more.